This evening it is our pleasure to have Tim Pawlenty. He served as the 39th governor of Minnesota from 2003 to 2011, and he was a Republican presidential candidate in the 2012 election from May until August of 2011. He has previously served in the Minnesota House of Representatives from 93 to 2003, and he served 2 terms as the majority leader. After narrow winning a Republican primary in 2002, he won a 3-way election for governor of Minnesota, and he was re-elected in 2006. His campaign focused on balancing the budget without raising taxes. And during Governor Pawlenty's governorship, he eliminated his state's budget deficit using spending cuts and borrowing heavily from earmarked funds. He did not raise income taxes during his governorship, but did enact targeted increases in sales tax and user fees. His administration advocated for numerous public work projects, including work on the North Star computer rail line and the construction of Target Field, a Major League Baseball field in Minneapolis. He signed a bill mandating 20% ethanol in gasoline by 2013. Important to note, he signed a bill mandating, or basically he cut health care spending to help balance the budget, and signed an executive order rejecting federal funds related to the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. And in 2007 and 2008, he served as chairman of the National Governors Association. Governor Pawlenty was born in St. Paul, and he was in Minnesota, and raised in nearby South St. Paul. I once just called a city, and we had some international students here, and they said, "What state are you talking to?" So I thought from now on I will always put the state behind it. He graduated from the University of Minnesota with a BA in political science, and he earned a JD from the University of Minnesota Law School. His early career included working as a labor law attorney and vice president of a software company. He's married, and he has a daughter, Anna, and I asked her, was it okay this evening if I introduced her? And she is a freshman here at the University of Kansas. It'll probably embarrass her a little bit, but I know you all want to see her, so would you please stand and look at them? Now I feel I have to apologize to her because I said, is it okay if I introduce you? I did not say I will have you stand up and face all these people, but as I told you, she's a freshman in American Studies. Well, I hope you're ready for a good evening. Bill Lacy, our director of the Dole Institute of Politics, will interview Governor Pawlenty, and you will have your opportunity to ask those questions that Bill Lacy does not. Bill Lacy, I turn it over to you and a warm Jayhawk welcome.
Welcome for the governor. Thank you. Thanks. Governor, it's great to have you here. Thanks so much for your very valuable time. Tell us a bit about how you got involved in politics and about your upbringing, a little bit of your personal background.
Sure, I'll be happy to do that, but let me first, if I might, Bill, say thank you to you and to the Dole Institute for your mission in political awareness and education and bringing speakers in and using this great institution, this facility, and the spirit of this place, which is people coming together perhaps with different political viewpoints and backgrounds and perspective, but coming together in common concern for your state and for our country to exchange ideas and to exchange the interaction with each other, and hopefully we all benefit from that. And I'm glad that you're here tonight. Thank you for taking the time on a busy weekday night to be here. I'm grateful for your attendance. And I also want to just say a word quickly about Bob Dole, if I might. I had a chance to meet him numerous times over the course of my career, and there's many things that can and have been said about Bob Dole. But one of the things I'd like to just highlight is the civil and decent nature of Bob Dole. You may agree or disagree with his policies, but I think you can easily see he's somebody that you can have a discussion with, share information and viewpoints, and come away friends. Our country needs more of that, and I think he was an astoundingly good leader in the United States Congress and served our country in such profound ways. He's a great man, a great leader, and I'm glad that this institute is named for him and continues to work in his honor. Yeah. As for me, I grew up in a meatpacking town, South St. Paul, Minnesota. Back in the day, in the 1960s, it was the home of the world's largest stockyards and meatpacking plants. And because of the demise of the Chicago stockyards back in the day, South St. Paul actually had the world's largest for at least a moment in time. So you might imagine in the 1960s, if you can spin your memory back to that decade, a town dominated by livestock operations and meatpacking plants, probably before a lot of the current EPA standards and other standards. So it was a kind of a blue-collar town. My dad, for much of his life, was a truck driver. Later in life, he got promoted to be a dispatcher, and we thought our family had hit the jackpot when he got promoted from off the road into being a dispatcher. I'm the youngest of 5 kids in my family, first one in my family able to go to college, and so my brothers and sisters didn't lack the capacity. They just didn't have the same opportunity that I did. My mom died when I was young. She was a homemaker for most of her life. She died when I was 16. And she had ovarian cancer and passed away when I was a sophomore in high school. And after my mom passed away, not too much longer after that, my dad lost his job for a while. And so at a pretty young age, I got to see some of life's challenges up front row seat to some of life's challenges. And so for me, I had to make some choices about what mattered. And when your mom passes away and your dad's unemployed for a while, it gives you a real sense of you better get your compass set in a big hurry. So I threw myself into school, and education was quite focused on that. Went to the University of Minnesota and got involved with the college Republicans. I was walking through a booth area there and saw some literature. I know the president of the college Republicans is here for KU, and got involved basically, Bill, as a very first test of my political interest was at campus college Republicans. And my first job was to go pass out brochures for Ronald Reagan's 1980 campaign for president. Then I went to the West Bank of the University of Minnesota, which is not exactly a conservative hotbed. And on my first day passing out brochures, somebody who didn't like Reagan spit on me. And so that was my first foray into politics.
When did you how did you come about running for office for the first time? How did you go about making that decision?
Well, Mary and I, my wife, had moved to a second-ring suburb called Eagan, Minnesota, and it was a developing suburb with lots of disputes about where stuff should go and how it should be developed and what it should look like, and a lot of community controversy about that. And a friend of mine was running for mayor to try to throw out the old regime, and a bunch of us helped him. And after he got elected, he said, look, I need help, so why don't you run for city council? So it really was a local, city-based, and the issues weren't what to do about Iran. It was, how are we going to pay for the sewer system that needs to go into this neighborhood, or the upgrade of this street, or, we have a water runoff problem. And when you're on the city council, there's only 5 people on the whole council. So if you get yourself and 2 other people to agree with you, you can get something done. It was quite different than being in the Minnesota legislature with 201 people, and every one of them thinks they're the class president. And so that's you got a little more persuasion to do. But I really enjoyed the city council. And by the way, if somebody had a concern with the city council, they showed up in the meeting room. So it was democracy in action. And if somebody didn't like what you were doing, you could pretty much be guaranteed they're going to be at the next meeting. The neighborhood was going to show up, and they'd give you some pretty direct measure of democracy. And I really enjoyed it.
Governor, you were a 2-term conservative governor in what is clearly a centrist or swing-style state. What kind of challenges did that present to governing as a conservative, and how did you compensate for that?
Well, you're being very charitable with my beloved home state of Minnesota, calling it a swing state, Bill. The facts are that Minnesota has the longest unbroken streak of any state in the nation voting for Democrat for president. The last time Minnesota voted for a Republican for president was in 1972, which was for Richard Nixon. Now, so some people think, well, Massachusetts is perhaps the most liberal state, or Vermont, or Hawaii, or maybe California, but Minnesota holds the record for the longest unbroken streak of voting for Democrat of any state in the country. And some of you are old enough to remember that in 1984, the year Ronald Reagan was reelected for President of the United States, they put up the electoral map on national television, and the entire country was colored red. Every state was red, signifying that they had voted for Ronald Reagan There was one exception on that map out of 50 states, Minnesota. So it's the land of Eugene McCarthy and Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale and Paul Wellstone and Jesse Ventura and now United States Senator Al Franken. But it is a state that has decidedly leaned towards the Democrats or left. Republicans can win there from time to time if the year is right and there's a tailwind and various other circumstances come up. And I was fortunate to win there. In my case, 2002 when I first ran was a decent Republican year. There was a sense that things needed to change, and we benefited from a kind of a change election.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the presidential election this year. Governor Romney seems to have kind of a rotating cast, almost a conservative of the day, who seems to be the popular alternative to him in the nomination fight.
I tried to be one of those, Bill,
Yes.
but it didn't work for me.
What does that say about the Republican electorate this year?
Well, it's unsettled, and of course the party that's not in power always has a bit of a little more of a scramble to decide who their candidate's going to be. And to be real blunt about it, look, the conservative and Republican coalition in the country consists of different parts. One part is national defense or security conservatives. One part is economic conservatives. One part is social conservatives. One part is libertarian or Tea Party conservatives, and some others. And any one person can be in more than one of those groups or grab onto more than one of those banners. But the Republican Party, like the Democratic Party, isn't a monolith, and a successful candidate has to stitch together those pieces and more to develop a coalition to be the nominee. And with respect to Governor Romney, who I support in the interest of full disclosure and feel very strong about that, the party has an open competition, and Newt Gingrich has been around for decades and has had a following over that time, and Ron Paul obviously has an appeal to a certain wing or slice of the party. Rick Santorum was relatively unknown to begin with, but obviously has surged. But I think what this surge and dropping back reflects this. A lot of the candidates weren't taken seriously initially. Not a lot was known about them. And as they surge, what happens is the national press says, well, we'd like you to get better acquainted with fill-in-the-blank candidate. And then guess what? When you get better acquainted with the fill-in-the-blank candidate, all of a sudden you get to see their voting record, their history, their personal challenges, and what you saw, not just the media, but the other opponents, of course, pound on that person too if they get too much traction, is what the country got reintroduced to or introduced to in the form of these conservative of the week, of the month, is they didn't like them. And so they regressed. And one by one, they fell back. And now the last example of that is probably going to be Rick Santorum. I'm not, he's the last one to surge. Everybody else had already surged and fallen back. So that'll be probably the last one of those surge moments.
Do you think he's going to get a surge out of the results today?
Well, I think if the states that are taking place as we're gathered here tonight include Colorado, Missouri, Minnesota, each one is a non-binding straw poll. Some people call them beauty contests. They don't assign delegates. They don't mean a lot. But the short answer to your question is yes. I think in those particular states, because of the dynamics of those states, Rick Santorum will do well in at least two of them and maybe all three of them. But it's not going to fundamentally change how the race unfolds from here. These are mostly non-binding, well, they are non-binding straw polls in states where the turnout is relatively modest and they have some different dynamics than the other states that preceded it.
You strike me as the kind of person who makes a tough decision and moves forward and keeps going on, but you also strike me as being a very thoughtful person. Have you looked back in the few months since you got out of the Republican race and thought, well, maybe I should have stayed in it, maybe I should have taken the chance to be that opponent du jour for Romney?
Only late at night when I drink alone in my basement, Bill.
You've never gotten that question before, have you, Governor?
No, the truth of the matter is, I had a fair shot at it. Do I regret some of the tactical decisions we make? I look back at my campaign, and of course, it's the nature of life when you look back at something in the review mirror, you say, gosh, I could have done that differently or better. So there's some tactical decisions that we made where I clearly think we could have done it differently or better. But we had our fair shot, and we didn't get it over the finish line, and we ran out of money, For our strategy in part was a unknown candidate from a relatively small state, under-resourced. We had to make a splash or some momentum relatively early, otherwise we'd be left behind. We didn't know that this thing would drag out in kind of clumped fashion for many, many months. So our thought was we had to put some big bet down early. We did, it didn't work, and we ran out of money. So that was one of the tactical decisions that we made. But all that being said, we had our shot, didn't get it done, but I'm proud to support Governor Romney. He's a knowledgeable, capable, gracious, electable candidate, and with a lot of executive experience. He's mature, he's grounded, he's thoughtful. I think he'd be a very good president.
Tell us a little bit about why you feel, obviously you strongly feel the 2012 election is critical to the future of the country, or you wouldn't have run for president, or you wouldn't be taking a very active role in Governor Romney's campaign. Why do you believe that?
It's a really great question, and you can just set aside political rhetoric or perspective and just look at it as an exercise in 8th grade mathematics. The United States federal government takes in from all revenue sources about $2.2 trillion a year in revenues. They're spending now over $3.5 trillion a year. So the deficit in 1 year, a few years ago, was $1.5 trillion, as it was a year ago, and now they're projecting $1 trillion per year deficits for as far as the eye can see. And so we now have a $15 trillion national debt. That's the accumulation. The annual red ink is called the deficit, and then the accumulation of that is rolled up into the term the debt. So keep these numbers in mind. $2.2 trillion of money coming in the door, about $3.5 trillion going out the door each year. So they're missing the mark by over $1 trillion a year. And then the cumulative debt is $15 trillion. But that doesn't count everything. If you count everything, and they've got a bunch of stuff off books that don't go into the $15 trillion, the actual debt of the United States is easily $60 trillion, and many experts believe close to $100 trillion on $2.2 trillion of revenue. That's more than 30, 40, 50 to 1 leverage. If they were a bank, they'd have to be shut down under the rules of banks. So you can set aside just the political rhetoric and look at it as a matter of middle school mathematics and realize the numbers don't work anymore. And then if I might, Bill, one last thing. If you look at a pie chart of where the money goes in the federal government, and you use 2 colors, blue and red, blue being the entitlement program, so this would be Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the national debt, and color that blue, that amount of spending on the pie chart is already over the halfway line. And at the rate at which it's growing, it'll be over the 3/4 line within 15 years, and almost all the rest is defense. There's a little sliver in there for everything else, parks, prisons, public safety, and the like. And so we are on a massive mathematical financial collision course. Regardless of whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, nothing, or something else, it's undeniable. And so I think this is the last election where the next Congress and the next president can actually do something about it short of an absolute going over the cliff, because it's going to be irretrievable after the next 4 or 5 years mathematically. It is going to be nearly impossible to make the numbers work if we don't make some significant changes soon. That's one of the reasons. And one last thing, there's lots of other issues that could emerge and change the trajectory of our country overnight. One of them is what's going to happen with respect to Iran's nuclear intentions. Perhaps President Obama between now and the end of the year, but certainly the next president is going to have to decide what to do with respect to Iran's undeniable nuclear ambitions and how they behave and what they do with that. Iran's intentions could change the region, could change the world very quickly. And so those are the kinds of issues that lead me to say this is a profoundly, historically, imminently important, transformative election.
Do you feel, Governor, that this election is also critical because it's going to offer 2 very distinct, probably one of the sharpest distinctions between style of government, the role of the federal government that we've had, say, since the Reagan campaigns?
Yes, I think that's fair, Bill. I think that's a fair statement. I mean, President Obama, over the course of now 3+ years has revealed himself to have a certain philosophy. I don't agree with it, but it's pretty clear what it is. I think it would be defined as a pretty traditional, Democrat, liberal philosophy, and the Republicans will nominate somebody who will clearly be, sharply right of center as well. And those two philosophies will compete in the political marketplace. When you look at this election, the economy will be the number one issue, although again, a security issue could pop overnight and change much of that. But keep in mind, when you look at the numbers of who's going to win in the election, the national polls don't really predict the actual slice that's going to decide it. The national polls take an average of all the voters across the whole country, and you say, well, that might make some sense, but that's not how the Electoral College works. It's a state-by-state process. And you can look at the states now and sort of predict how many of the states are going to vote based on this past history. I can tell you pretty assuredly sitting here on KU's campus tonight how New York is going to vote in the 2012 election. I can give you a pretty good prediction how Vermont's going to vote. I can give you a pretty good prediction how Massachusetts is going to vote, Hawaii, Kansas, Alabama, and others. But what it really comes down to, of course, are those last 6 or 8 states, namely Florida, North Carolina, New Hampshire, maybe Pennsylvania, but certainly Ohio, Wisconsin, Iowa, Colorado, maybe New Mexico. Those are the states, add a couple, subtract a couple, that will swing the election one way or the other. And those independent voters in those swing states are the ones that everybody's going to be after. And it's about 30% of them in those states call themselves independents, but about half of them are leaning strong one way or the other. So you're down to 15% of the vote in 6 or 8 states that will be the hinge for the election. And if you poll those individuals today and ask them, how do you feel about President Obama's re-election, it looks more favorable to Republicans. But that's today, and the election's not till November, and as you know, a lot can happen in the meantime.
If you assume that Governor Romney is the Republican nominee, obviously running against the president in the fall, how would you almost got to this point, but how would you handicap that general election?
I think it'll be a close election, and I think it'll favor Republicans for this reason. The economy is going to be a main issue. Most people in that swing and independent voter group that I just mentioned are dissatisfied with the current economy. They're dissatisfied with President Obama's handling of the economy, and they are prepared to throw him out if the Republicans offer a viable alternative. In my view, Mitt Romney is the most viable alternatives, and the polls confirm that. If you pit Obama versus Romney, it's basically a dead heat. If you pit Obama versus one of the other Republican candidates, Obama wins in the current polling.
One last question on politics, and I want to talk a little bit about issues before we open up to questions and answers from the audience. Obviously, there's some skepticism among Tea Partiers and conservatives about Governor Romney. What would you say to anybody here tonight who might say, I don't believe Governor Romney is far enough to the right for me? What would you say to them to encourage them to vote for him in the fall if he is the nominee?
Well, I'd say a few things. First of all, take his record as governor and put it into some context. He governed in Massachusetts. It's not unlike governing as a Republican or conservative in Minnesota. It's not exactly easy territory. So, if you're in a state where the Republicans have the legislature and you got a Republican governor and they're sending you the Republican, issue of the week, and you're signing it and having, cookies and coffee celebrating the great piece of progress you made, that's not the most difficult work in the world. That's pretty easy. And there's some states where that's, how the stars align. But you try doing that in Massachusetts or Minnesota or some other places, it's a real dogfight. So you got to factor in that environment, and then the question is, can you still get stuff done in a difficult environment? And he did. Cut taxes, cut spending, reduced unemployment, reduced employment, stood for a number of other important conservative social and economic causes. And so is he a conservative? Yes. Is he perfect? No. But here's the other thing I would say to the critics of Mitt Romney from the right. They say, well, he's not conservative. Well, yes, he is. But number two, I'd say, compared to who? Yeah, now, compared to Newt Gingrich? And compared to Rick Santorum, compared to Ron Paul, they all have things in their record that make them imperfect candidates. And the reason that Mitt gets a lot of the heat is because he's the front runner, but when you surge or highlight any one of the other candidates, and guess what? It doesn't look so good either. I'll spare you the walk through the park of the records of these other candidates, but I know their records. And I can still give you a good 5 minutes on each one of them as to why each of these other candidates are flawed from a conservative perspective as well. And they just kind of fly under the radar screen for most of the campaign because they haven't been viewed as serious until their moment of the surge. Then they get reintroduced to the country in their moment of surge, and the country says, no, thank you, and then they regress back down, and that's what's happened. And like I said, I think Rick now will be the last viable surger, if you will, if that's a word. I sound like Bush now, President Bush. The surger.
Let's talk just briefly about issues. You've got they have the luxury of having you here tonight. You're off a presidential bid. You obviously had to give a lot of thought to these pressing issues facing the country. So I'd like to get your thoughts. What should be done? What should the Republicans, if they win the election, what should they try to do about the economy?
Well, I always say
that would be different from the president.
The main thing about the economy is we want to grow jobs. So if you go around my state, and I'm sure it's the same in Kansas or your home states if you're not from here, and you ask people, what do you care about? What makes your life either good or bad? What do you really get passionate about? What most people will say after they talk about their faith is they'll talk about their family. And they'll say, I really want to get my kids to college, and I'm worried how I'm going to pay for it. Or they'll say, I really want to make sure my family has health care, and I'm worried if I can pay for it. Or I want to make sure I have a roof over my head, and I don't know if I can pay the rent or the mortgage. Or they don't have a job, or they'd like to get a job, but if they got a little extra money, in Minnesota, they'll talk about getting a boat and going fishing in northern Minnesota. Or watching the Vikings come down and beating up on the Kansas City Chiefs, something like that. But the point is, all of these things hinge on whether you have a job. So for most Americans, the number one pathway to whether they're going to have a decent quality of life is whether they have a job, preferably a good paying job. So the best question we can ask and answer ourselves are, what are those things that we can do to make it more likely, not less likely, that jobs are going to grow, businesses are going to start, prosper, add people, and the like. And with all due respect to the good people in Washington, D.C. who spent most of their life there, the best answers to how do you grow the economy and grow jobs do not come from people who've spent their entire adult life in Washington, D.C. or in government or as a parasite of Washington, D.C. or the related activities. They actually come from hardworking people who start businesses, invest in businesses, and grow businesses. There are 6 million businesses in our country. 5.9 million of them have 500 employees or fewer. The entire backbone of this entire economy is small and medium-sized businesses. And you don't have to take it from me. You can go ask them or have a survey done and say, what would it take to make you grow your business and add employees? And you know what they say? They all say it a little differently, but they all say the same thing. Get the government off my back. Some talk about taxes, some talk about regulation, some talk about insurance costs, some talk about permitting delays and costs and burdens, some talk about the uncertainty of government actions in other areas, but the basic message from almost every one of those people in some manner or degree is, you need to make the load on me lighter, not heavier. Do things to encourage me, not discourage me. Give me certainty and confidence that government actions are going to respect and understand private markets, entrepreneurial activity, the deployment of capital, and growing jobs. And this is not about, whether we like or don't like business people. This is about whether my mom and dad, whether your brother and sister, whether your son and daughter is going to have a job. And if we don't do those things in this country to encourage and inspire entrepreneurs, then we got a very bleak future. And I'll give you this statistic. About 5% of the people in the country are the folks who have the personality type, the risk tolerance to start and grow businesses. If that 5% becomes 6, 7, 8, or 9%, we've got an extremely bright future. If that 5% becomes 4, 3, 2, or 1%, we are in deep doo-doo. And that's where we're at right now. And you got a bunch of really good people in this country who would, get going, but they feel like they're beaten down. from an entrepreneur and small and medium-sized business standpoint. And with all due respect to the president, I don't think he has the background or the knowledge or the personal connection to that part of the country to understand it. And in fact, I think he's doing things to make it more burdensome for them and be more discouraging and counterproductive. That's the number one issue, again, not to be pro-business, but to be pro-job. You cannot be pro-job and anti-business, because that's like being pro-egg and anti-chicken. I mean, those two things don't work in harmony. We have to have businesses growing and providing jobs if we're going to be able to offer a quality of life to our citizens. And right now it's, as everybody knows, pretty anemic in that category.
A few minutes ago, you identified as another big challenge facing us, the national debt. What would you do about the national debt? How would you approach actually solving that problem?
Well, if you remember the pie chart that I mentioned to you earlier, the blue part being Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the national debt, growing so fast that it'll soon not be over the halfway mark, but over the three-quarter mark. And again, these are my personal views, not the views of other candidates. So I'll give you my personal views. We have to reform the entitlement programs. We have to look each other in the eye and have the courage and the conviction to tell the truth, be straight with each other, and offer specifics. And so the starting point should be this. If we made you a promise and you're on those programs now, or you're anywhere near eligibility for the programs, there'll be no changes. Because it's not fair to have people work their whole life, rely on a promise and a commitment, make the contributions to the program, and then have the rules change when they're in or near eligibility for the program. So what I'm about to describe to you would only relate to the next generation, the people coming up like Anna. So in Social Security, again, no changes for anybody on the program or near it, but from my view, we have to raise the retirement age gently and gradually over time for the people coming up. The current retirement age was set when people lived much shorter lifespans. It's much longer now. We have to gently raise it over time. That would help a lot. Number two, we have to means test part of the Social Security program. I don't like means testing because it is, pits one economic class against another, but we're in such desperate straits we have to do something. Again, this wouldn't affect anybody on or near the program now, but for the next generation, we have to say, look, if you're wealthy, you're not going to get as big of an annual cost of living adjustment as if you're middle income or lower income. Those types of changes would go a long ways towards stabilizing and fixing the program, and they're not radical, and I believe they'd be fair. If we have an honest conversation with each other about it, I think we could fix it. In Medicaid, this is the medical program for the poor that's going up off the charts. I think the federal government should decide what it can afford instead of having it on autopilot, and then block grant it to the states and allow them to manage it on a state-by-state basis. I think it would be run better, and we'd get more value for the dollar. And then lastly, on Medicare, Medicare, the health care program for seniors, what I suggest is that I'll keep Medicare as an option. Again, for anybody on the program, you keep it, but even for the next generation, it could still be an option for you, but have it compete in a marketplace against a number of other options that people might find more attractive, and then allow a subsidy for people to make the choice that's best for them, with a higher subsidy for people who are low and middle income than for people who are higher income.
I have one last question, but then we're going to open it up to your questions. We'll have a couple of students who will have cordless mics. If you want to ask the governor a question, raise your hand. Don't get my attention, don't get his attention, get the attention of the students who are carrying the mics, and they'll bring one by and you'll get a chance to ask a question. But my last question is very simple, Governor. If Governor Romney winds up as the next president, is there any chance we might see Governor Pawlenty in his cabinet?
I can't afford that KU tuition on a cabinet salary. No, I've taken myself off the VP list, consideration list, and as to something else, I don't know. I haven't really thought that far ahead, but for me, I do enjoy public service, but I also have to, there comes a time where you got to turn the page and move on to other things in life too. And I'm happy to volunteer for Governor Romney. He's a friend, I like him, and I hope he's the next president, but beyond volunteering my time, I haven't made any commitments.
Fair enough. Okay, questions for Governor Pawlenty?
Well, first, that's one. That's good. Governor, one of the concerns that I have as a longtime Republican precinct guy, county chairman, state committee, all those things over the years, is that when Ronald Reagan ran in 1980, there was a lot of enthusiasm. We could see the vision that he was painting for America. And the thing that bothers me the most about Governor Romney is I don't feel the enthusiasm. I don't see the vision. I don't see where he wants to take us. And I think that is a recipe for disaster. And I would, just to tell you more of a question, but tell him he needs to get his act together, okay? Get some vision, and some go out and kick Obama's butt, okay? Anyway, what do you think he needs to do, I guess?
Well, the vision for the country from Governor Romney's perspective and from a Republican perspective more broadly is to try to get government properly scoped within the relationship with people in their lives. And we got to have a government that lives within its means, doesn't spend more than it takes in, respects and encourages entrepreneurs, gets the private economy going, doesn't just rely on a government economy. And I think people have figured this out. You ask most people what they think is the main issues facing the country. If you asked them 10, 15 years ago whether they cared about the deficit, most people would say, yeah, I kind of care, but it's down the list. You ask them now, right after their job, government spending is a close second or third. So don't underestimate how powerful the notion is that government's out of control and overstepped its boundaries and that we need somebody to rein it in. It is a powerful sentiment. The other thing to be a little careful about is this. For those of us who are very active politically, whether it be us on the right or others on the left, they love the smash face, angry, kick the chairs over, throw the table, punch somebody rhetorically in the mouth, and we all cheer and we love it. But keep in mind, the last 10% of the electorate who decides the election, they're a little different than us. And for example, one group in that is politically unaffiliated suburban women. Guess what? They don't like angry, mean guys. And you get somebody who's an angry, mean guy who looks, is unpleasant and worse. That's not the best thing. So if you look at the Republican candidates, for example, right now, who does the best amongst women? Guess who it is? It ain't Newt Gingrich. It ain't Mitt Romney. It ain't Rick Santorum, and it ain't Ron Paul, it's Mitt Romney. So it's more complicated than just who makes you or me feel good, because we're the committed conservatives and we want to see somebody rhetorically really get after Obama. It makes us feel good, it affirms our feelings, but you also have to keep in mind who that last 10% is that's going to swing the election and how they feel.
Why do you think Romney has trouble connecting with ordinary people?
I think the question was, why does Governor Romney have trouble connecting with ordinary people? Well, if you look at the results of the states that have happened so far, he's actually done really well. New Hampshire would be an example. Florida, which is a big, diverse state, Mitt Romney got more votes than Newt Gingrich, Rick Santorum, and Ron Paul combined amongst all subgroups: seniors, young people, Hispanics, women. He did extremely well. In fact, outperformed the historical averages in those states compared to other Republican candidates. So the narrative or the theme is somehow he's not connecting, but if you look at his results, by the way, got 50% in the Nevada caucus on Saturday, one of the highest in the modern history of the country. There wasn't anybody even close to him. You look at the next states where there's an open process, not tonight's processes in terms of caucuses, but a more higher turnout process. Michigan, Arizona coming up, he's going to do very well. So I respectfully just reject the premise, if you look at the numbers, not the rhetoric, that he's doing badly. He's not. He's doing actually quite well. And then number two, people got to get to know him. Everybody's got a different style. And so he's got a different style. I think if people get acquainted with him over the course of the campaign, they'll see a gracious, generous, smart, family man who's kind and strong and smart and effective and has succeeded in everything he's done. But everybody's got a different style. So I think it's going to be a process of getting better acquainted. And And I hope that you'll have a chance to give him a fuller hearing on that front. By the way, people always say, well, he inherited all his money. Well, he didn't. He has said many times he didn't inherit any of his money. He went out and made it. So has he been extraordinarily successful? Yes. But that should be applauded in our country, not penalized or looked down on. We want people to be successful.
My question's on health care, and I'd like your vision if there was a Republican in the White House and the Republicans control the Senate and the House. What would health care be like under those circumstances?
Good question.
If there were a Republican Congress and a Republican president, I think, first of all, you'd see the repeal of Obamacare, or the Patient Protection Act, as it's called. And I think you'd see then an effort to try to reform it in a different direction. And without getting into all the details, because people's eyes glaze over, I think what you'd want to see is protect people who are on the current public programs. But more broadly, we've got to move towards what's called consumer-directed health care. So I sometimes use this analogy. It's a little crude, but I think it's about right. If you want to really study these issues, you can read white papers, you can go to seminars, you can hang out at events like this, you can stay up all night and watch cable television, and you'll learn a lot. And if you got time to do that, that's great. But if all you really need to know about public policy, you can accomplish in one Saturday night by going to 2 weddings. Go to one wedding where there's an open bar, and then go to one wedding where there's a cash bar. You'll see 2 very different sets of behaviors. When people think stuff is free, they use it differently. And again, these are my personal views. So in healthcare right now, what's one of the main problems? Most people, unless you're really dedicated, don't have any idea what the cost of the services are. It's hard to even find out unless you really dig into it. And 2 is, we don't really know the quality measurements. So if you went to the clinic here on campus versus the clinic or the hospital in Lawrence versus the one in Kansas City, you might get the exact same procedure, but depending on certain circumstances, the price could vary wildly, as could the quality measurements. So I'll give you an example of that. In Minnesota, we got some pretty robust health care in our state. And we were going bankrupt with our state employees, not literally bankrupt, but the costs were going through the roof, and the unions didn't like it, we didn't like it because the costs were going up too high. So we said, why don't we try a new system? And we said to our state employees, you can go anywhere you want for your health care, free choice. But if you choose to go somewhere high in price and low in quality, you're going to pay more. And if you go somewhere high in quality and low in price, you'll pay less. Guess what happened? 90% or so of the state employees migrated to lower cost, higher quality healthcare providers. Why? Because now they got some financial skin in the game. But it only works if you give people user-friendly, meaningful information so that they can compare. If I fall out on the sidewalk out here tonight and have a heart attack, I can't grab my iPad and start doing an internet search for who's got the best, cardiac center in the Lawrence area. That doesn't make any sense. But most of the money in healthcare goes into 5 or so chronic conditions. It goes into obesity, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and conditions related to end-of-life care. And where you go get your care matters a ton as to both price and quality. And I'm not talking 2 or 3% swings, in many cases 10, 20, 30, 40% swings, and people don't know it. They pick a doc or a clinic mostly because the magazines are nice or the nurse is nice to them or it's close by. Well, that's great, that's fine, but we have to incentivize people with user-friendly information to get to higher quality, efficient places, and we got to get them user-friendly information. That's a very simple, oversimplification of it, but that's the direction we have to head. Get people that information and then let them do whatever they want, freedom, but let's also give them incentives to do wise things.
Quinn, do you have a question back there?
Yes. I read some of the things the statements you made, and I want to ask you specifically. You indicated that Mary, your wife, was a student of the Bible. And I know it seems like it's been pushed under the rug a lot, but what would you say to the evangelical vote who do not want to vote for a Mormon?
Well, the question relates to Governor Romney's religion, and I would encourage people to look not at a particular religion, but at his values. So Mary and me and Governor Romney and Ann Romney don't share the same religion, but we share the same values. So look at his behavior. Look at what he values in life. Look at his value system. He's been married to Ann for 43 years. A loving husband, loving grandparent, loves his family, terrific family person. He's incredibly generous. He's incredibly charitable. He's a gracious person. He's not been tied up in scandal. He's not done things that have been viewed as, misguided or wrong, measured by any number of value metrics. So while we don't share the same religion, we share the same values. And I know him. He's a good person. He's a solid person. Like I said, he's a wise, mature, thoughtful, grounded, good person. And so anybody who gets up and makes value judgments from a particular perspective, I'd say, well, you can look at the rhetoric and the words, or you can look at his behavior. And by the way, that's not the case with all candidates.
We've struggled in Washington to cut even $1 trillion over the next 10 years. And I'm just curious what you think the pace of cutting needs to be over the next 10 years, an amount. How quickly do we need to cut? How much? And do you feel the American people can stand it? Will they put up with cutting without the pendulum swinging back to a more giving government?
It's a great question. Thank you. And again, to put it in the measurements of earlier, 2.2 trillion coming in the door, spending 3.5 trillion, give or take. You got to give me a little grace with the numbers, but it's basically the numbers. You see this in Greece now, where they've tried to go through austerity measures, and they have riots in the street because people think it's too much too fast. We don't need to solve the whole problem overnight, but if we can meaningfully signal to the markets and to the world and to the people that we owe the money to, that we've got a strategic plan, that we're committed to it and making significant measurable progress, that would be a tremendous piece of advance. So again, I don't think it all has to be solved overnight, but I think you could lay it out over a reasonable period of time that these things are going to be brought in alignment. You can't really tackle it unless you reform the entitlement programs. Anybody who walks in here and tells you that they're going to protect defense, by the way, I think we should, they're not going to touch entitlements, and they're going to cut it all out of the waste, fraud, and the rest of the waste, fraud, and abuse, that little sliver that's left, again, 3/4 of the blue by year 15, the rest is defense. There's a little sliver in there for everything else. There's not enough of the rest of that sliver to solve the problem, even if you reduced that little sliver dramatically. So I don't have a particular time frame for you to answer your question directly, but you can't go from where we are overnight, but you do have to lay it out, I think, over a reasonable period of time. I think Paul Ryan had it, if I remember correctly, somewhere between 7 and 10 years.
Gwen?
To balance.
There's a big question nowadays about the attempt to buy our vote with the super PACs and those type of things. What is your feeling on Citizens United and the campaigning and access that the major donors are getting?
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, I can't quite see. Can you just raise your hand so I can see who you are? Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court has said that spending money or giving money on political speech is a protected First Amendment activity. So we can all have a view about that, but the bottom line is it's a form of free speech, and it's a protected form of free speech, and that's the rule that we have. I have some experience in so-called campaign finance reform in Minnesota, where they tried to limit contributions, limit the percent of money that you could take from PACs, lobbyists, large contributors combined, limit this, limit that. And what happened is the money going into the campaigns directly became so limited that almost as much money, in fact more money, went into these third-party groups that had even less disclosure, even less sunshine, and massively larger contributions because they didn't have to play by the same rules. So it's like Jell-O. You squeeze it over here, it pops out over there. Almost every time some state or entity has tried to limit political funding to campaigns directly, they've just pushed it into third-party groups. So I would prefer at this point, given our choices, if we just allowed the money to come to the candidates directly, but require full and instant disclosure on the internet, instead of waiting 3 months, 4 months, 5 months for the report, people timing their contributions so they don't get reported until after the election, et cetera. Just have the money come in, have it disclosed on the internet, within 24 hours. And otherwise, I think you're just pushing money into shadow groups and third-party groups that have even less accountability. And that's what you see going on. The super PACs are a form of that. And the reason they're given to the super PACs is because there's a limit on how much they can give to the candidates directly. And you can't stop what goes on. All you do is shift it around. So let's just be realistic about it and allow it to happen directly and disclose the whole thing, and then have a debate about who's getting unduly influenced because of the size or nature of the contribution.
We're going to take a couple more questions, but Governor, I wanted to ask you this. You have a lot of KU students here tonight, a lot of young people. What would you say to them, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or independents, about the importance of taking a role in this and future elections and also public service?
Well, two things. One is we need you. If you're a young person in this room tonight, we need your talent, your energy, your creativity, your passion and vision for the future, your collaborative nature with us, intergenerationally. And regardless of your political background, our country, and I know everybody in this room cares about our country, a democracy depends on an informed and engaged citizenry. We will not have an effective, functioning democracy if we have large numbers and percentages of our citizenry checked out. And so if you care about the country, and I know you do, I hope you'll hear the words of our founders embedded in our founding documents and related documents, that we can't have this and protect and perpetuate this cherished country that we have unless we have an informed and engaged citizenry. It's precious, but it requires each of us to do something. So I hope the young people in the room are inspired to be engaged and to be involved. And there's lots of different ways to do it. And I would just say, as you hear the call to service, different people can serve in different ways. So not everybody needs to or should run for office. In fact, many people shouldn't run for office. But for those who have the skill set and the interest, it's a great thing. But there's lots of other ways to serve. And I love the notion that we are put on this earth to serve causes and purposes bigger than just ourselves. When I was governor, I had a chance, sadly, to go to many funerals, mostly for fallen soldiers, but also some police and firefighters. And so over the course of my years as governor, I probably went to as many as 100 or more funerals. And I listened very carefully to the messages about the measure of the people and the reflections of the people whose lives we were remembering and celebrating. And nobody ever stood up at that pulpit or by the gravesite and said, I really like John. He had a great BMW. Man, wasn't that 5 Series BMW just awesome, with the big engine in it? Or nobody ever said, I really like Bill. That house that he had, that 20 acres that he had out by the lake was just great. That's not what they say. They say, this person was a great family person, a great person of faith. He served or she served in church or community or charity or philanthropy, was a good friend, was a good relative, was a good parent, was a loving person in some measure. So we all can serve in some way. It's different for different people, but for those who are called to public service, it's a meaningful and important exercise. It's a tremendous contribution to community and state. We need good people in public service. Because if good people don't step forward and get involved, and we just delegate it, to the people who are left, it's not reflective of our whole country. It's not reflective of our whole state. And if good people check out, then the goofballs take over. And we got enough goofballs in politics. So please do what you can to be involved and engaged.
Easy clarifying question. You said that Governor Romney cut unemployment and cut employment. Did you mean government employment?
Well, while he was governor of Massachusetts?
Right.
Yeah, to be precise, while he was governor of Massachusetts, the unemployment rate fell and the employment rate went up. Now, I'm saying that he personally did all of that, but it happened on his watch under his policies in Massachusetts.
In the final moments before the Iowa caucus, there was almost an avalanche of anti-Gingrich attack ads linked to a pro-Romney super PAC, and especially in his after-caucus speech, it seemed that Gingrich's only point was to no longer seek the presidency, but take Romney down as far as he could. But there was a decent momentum surge after the Iowa caucus, and with this win in South Carolina, do you think Gingrich's focus has turned back toward the presidency and less toward bringing down Romney?
Well, when I was the majority leader of the Minnesota House, and in the Minnesota House, we always had a rule that we would invoke that would say you can make position statements and talk about issues, but you can't question somebody else's motives. So I can't question, not because of that rule, but generally what Newt is thinking or what Newt's up to. I can only look at behavior and make some assessments about that. Newt has served the conservative cause in the country for a lot of years, a lot of decades, and he's got a lot of intellectual horsepower, and he's a good speaker. But there's a big difference between being a good after-dinner speaker and being president of the United States. And I had a chance to be around the presidency when President Bush was there, when I was governor. I spent a fair amount of time in and around him, those activities in the White House under various circumstances. Imagine a scenario where every day you got up 7 days a week and almost everything you did was on camera. Every word that you uttered had global implications. The entire country looks to you for guidance and direction, philosophically, policy, personally, and you got cameras in your face all day, every day. Setting aside particular policy directions, you've got to be the kind of person who has a certain sturdiness to him or her. You have to have your compass set. You have to have your feet on the ground, I think, to be an effective leader, particularly in these times. I can tell you with certainty that Mitt Romney has that kind of sturdiness about him. I would suggest to you to think about whether the other candidates really do. As to Newt's motives at this point, I would have to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that I think he thinks he can be president of the United States. I don't think he would be the best candidate for the job. But I can't tell you what I think his motives are post-Iowa and whether he's on a vengeance mission or he thinks he can win or some combination of the two. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say he thinks he can win. I don't think he can. I don't think he should. But I'll say that's what I think he's thinking.
Okay. Governor, thank you so
All
much
right,
for
thanks,
joining
Bill.
us tonight.
Appreciate it. Thank you.